right, I know it's the end of the day, so first of all, thank you for hanging in there with me. This is a topic I am extremely passionate about, so we'll jump right in. I will skip this slide since you heard a little bit about who Mercury 13 is. We're an MCO focused exclusively on women's football, and our first team we acquired was FC Como. So if you haven't checked us out, please do. All right, what we'll talk about is we're going to talk a little bit about the history of women's football, some of the growth data, which we get really excited to talk about, and some of the challenges surrounding that. So what I'm hoping is that if you haven't heard about some of the challenges we have with data in women's football, I will be educating you. If you're aware of it, then this is a good reminder, and I will ask for your advocacy, because this is a group of data champions. And I think we're all here because we believe in the power of data. I certainly do. I believe it makes us smarter. It can help us grow things. And I think it's one of the things that's holding us back a little bit in the growth of women's football. All the other growth is there, but we have this continuing challenge, unfortunately. And I think we all can agree that football analytics, data and analytics, is no longer a nice to have. It is a strategic weapon. It is extremely important. It informs our decisions, important decisions that affect us. This guy knows a little bit something about winning, and he thinks it's so important that in 10 to 15 years, the technology will be making the decisions. I don't know about that. We're a little bit behind that in the growth of analytics in women's football. But the challenge we've got is you can't have all these great data analytics, a lot of what we've talked about today, without all the data. And yes, I'm that person on LinkedIn that when somebody posts a really cool new model or research, I'm like, hey, what about the women's side? Have we looked at this from the women's perspective? just to be that voice to continue to say, we need to look at this because this is important to the growth of our game as well. So the question is why are we having this challenge? How do we get here? And so I want to take you back in history a little bit to talk about how we've gotten to the point where we're challenged with data. And some of you might know this, but I love telling this story. This is a picture of the Dick Kerr ladies. They were a team that formed out of a munitions factory in World War I. They played from 1917 to 1965. They're probably most famously known for the Boxing Day match. The Boxing Day match they played actually held the attendance record for women's football for 92 years. 92 years. Over 50,000 people showed up on that Boxing Day match. 10 to 15,000 more were turned away because of capacity. But that most people believe that the success of that match, keyword success, was motivation for the FAA to ban women from playing football in the proper facilities, in the FAA-owned facilities in 1921. So it wasn't because we weren't pulling a crowd. It was actually because we were pulling a crowd, most likely. But what most people don't know is this team played on after the ban. The ban didn't prevent women from playing football, and other countries, by the way, followed suit with their own bans. It just kept us out of playing facilities and having the resources that would allow us to actually pull the crowd. But prior to that ban, this team, they would pull about 5,000 to 6,000 per match. That's actually pretty good. It probably mirrors what an NWSL team is on the smaller markets. I go to the Chicago Red Stars game. I live in Chicago. That's probably what we get on an average match. So they were pulling a crowd. They also had really strong commercial ability. So the Dick Kerr ladies played for charity, and at any given time, they were contributing 5x than their male counterparts are in today's money, and their height, that was about $5 million. That is nothing to sneeze at. They played over 755 games, and they lost only 34. So these guys were good. They were really, really good. So a lot of talk is that this is a recent surge, but the reality is that the product on the pitch has always been good. The commercial value has always been good, going back 100 years. But the ban set us back 50 years. 50 years we lost in history, in depth of data. 50 years we lost in the ability to play in facilities where we could actually accommodate larger crowds, and that has set us back. Now, the good news is that today, women's sports overall is looked at as big business. And of course, I had to get my girl Caitlin in here. It's going to surpass $1.3 billion. That's about a 300% increase. And it's driven by commercial, team sponsorships, partnerships, growth in all those areas, which we'll dive into a little bit, so I can give you some data on that. I love the conversations about how we've seen these recent surges, and that's great. But the reality is that we had this great start, and we were put on pause for about 50 years. So just jumping into a little bit about the growth data. On the sponsorship and merchandise side, for the FA Women's Super League, the sponsorship values have literally doubled. And what's great is that the sponsors have reported very high return on revenue, so 400%, that's a nice number. Women's sports merchandise is expected to hit over $4 billion. In fact, this shirt I'm wearing here, this made $3 million in a year. So there's lots of growth in both of these areas. Viewership and fans are also really growing. We've seen over 165% growth from the World Cup viewership, over 200% for the Euros, and average attendance is up in every single major league across Europe and the US. That also has created more fans, so 115 million fans across the major European markets, and for perspective, that's about 38% of the population of those countries. So we're seeing lots of interest. And by the way, those fans are also planning to engage more, about half of them over the next 2 to 3 years. That's pushed for more coverage, more media coverage, just in the last few years. We've gone from 5% to 15%, so it's tripled, expected to go as high as 20%. Still not where we want to be compared to men's sports, but it's getting much, much better. We're also seeing growth in media deals as well, so a 40x increase in the NWSL deal. So lots of good growth factors. We talked a lot about these valuations. This came up a couple times today, but I love to put these numbers up. The NWSL value is up 57% just year on year. So if you were Ron Burkle and bought the San Diego Wave and paid under $5 million for a franchise fee in 2019, he sold that team last year for $115 million. So that's a pretty good return on investment. Most valuable team, again, is Angel City at $250 million. They were just acquired, a controlling stake by Bob Iger, who's the CEO of Disney. So very high-profile ownership, lots of great return on investment. I love these numbers. When I was pitching an investor one time, he said to me, I'm worried about losing money. I'm like, well, let me show you a couple of transactions. We can talk about that. The value is very good. In the US, the NWSL is really outgrowing other men's sports in terms of the rate of growth. So you would think, with all of this growth, we would have the data analytics and the resources that we need. But the challenge is that we had this deficit because we lacked the depth. We weren't collecting data all those years. And we're growing super fast. So the FA says that 2.3 million more will play football this year. So we had this deficit in collection. It's not keeping pace with the growth. And that's a huge challenge. Everyone in this room understands that the more data you have, the better your analytics is going to be. So the title of the talk is the importance of growth, data to the growth of women's football. In all of these areas where men's football and many other sports have huge histories of data, the last company I worked for, we had data that went back to the 1800s in some sports. So depth and history was definitely there. But for women, we still need a lot of progress in all of these areas. So coverage and event data, so that this is more accessible, more live data is available. I think I have every app downloaded for women's football. There's not that many of them. But the fans need it, media needs it. That's really important for our growth. Performance data. We're going to dive into this a little bit more, but analyzing women's performance, it's different. Women are different. They're not men. So we need a little bit more focus on that. Youth and academy data, you just heard in the last panel. In the US, we don't have the academy structure. But in general, if you're looking for younger talent outside of your own academies, it's pretty difficult. So we're not only missing the ability to find the rising stars, we're also missing documenting these rising stars, right? So I remember one of the things that got me was looking at an article that was written about Sam Kerr and how for maybe like the first portion of her career, there was no video of all her goals as a professional. So can you imagine like the same thing for one of the major stars in men's football? We have video of David Beckham going back to, I think, when he first took his first steps. But for women, that's not the case. So we're missing telling the stories of these rising stars, and we're missing the ability to develop that talent as well. And then lastly, and I think this is probably a challenge for every team, which is data about fans, viewership, for social media engagement. Women's football fans are not men's football fans. They're different. And we're still getting to know who they are, what they like. They're about half women and half men. They're younger, they're more educated, but they are different than men's football fans. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that we've had. So to start off with, we just have some basic coverage issues. And I first have to say thank you to Statsbomb, not only for giving me the platform to talk about this, because I really appreciate that, but also for being a leader in this space to actually put your solutions out there for us to use. We really appreciate it. It's a conversation we just need to have because people just aren't thinking about it on a daily basis. But we don't have a lot of the lower tier data. So most data is only collected in the top tier leagues. There's over 200 women's teams globally. So I don't even know what percentage, because it's hard to find the facts on this, that is actually covered today, but it's a very, very small percentage. A lot of that is probably tied to the fact that most collection monetization processes is tied to sports betting, because the price of rights is very high, and so the people who collect data need to monetize it. So I get it, but the ecosystem isn't working for us for women's sports. Media coverage, when we have it, that has gotten better. It's also affecting our ability to collect data. When you heard a little bit about broadcast tracking data, well, if you've watched women's football on TV in the last few years, we haven't exactly had stellar quality coverage, even in the top tier league. So sometimes single cameras are used, the quality is very low, so you can't either collect remotely through broadcast or you can't use CV. Even broadcast tracking is not very good. That has set us back as well. As the quality of the broadcasts go up, that's going to change. But historically hasn't been the best. Performance data. So women's performance data is different. We are a little bit more complicated because there are things within our cycle that actually affects performance. Most of the solutions today are built for men's teams. They're also built more for the coaches. So the challenge for an athlete is that we maybe would like to empower them to manage some of their own performance, especially to be able to manage some of their biometric data, their cycle data, so that they can have a little bit more control over it. This is just a little bit more complicated from a woman's perspective, but it's really important to address. And there are some new products coming out on the market that are starting to integrate that data. And I think that's really powerful, especially to empower the athletes themselves to actually show up fully optimized, understanding how they can optimize their bodies based on where they're at. Injury data. This is another huge area. So this stat really killed me. Since 2021, 87 players from the top 8 world's top women's soccer leagues have torn ACLs. This has been a big conversation in the last few years as more and more notable players have torn ACLs, but a lot of the traditional data that we've had and models that have been trained to look at this have been trained on men's data because women's data wasn't collected. So this is something that really needs to be solved. And again, there are solutions coming out that are starting to look at this. There's more research, there's more funding around this. It's really, really important. A lot of teams will take a big hit when your star player goes down with an ACL injury. So this is a solution that we need to solve, and again, we need data to solve that. Youth and talent data, we talked a little bit about this already, but there's very limited data and data collection around the youth sector. This is another area where I'm starting to see some startups that are looking at collecting 11 to 17. In particular in the US, this is more challenging because we don't have academies. I've even heard some teams talking about like building their own because it's so important for us to be able to do this. This is essential for us to be able to find younger talent, develop it. We do that a lot through the academy structures, but in the US we don't have that ability. But if we could have more data and we could actually be able to tap into that, that would be extremely helpful. But I also think it's important to be able to tell the stories of our rising stars as well. I mean, there's a big portion of data that is tied to storytelling that is really, really important for the growth of almost any sport. So fan and broadcaster data. When I remember seeing some of the broadcasts when I was here in Europe several times and seeing some of the really advanced analytics that they have on Sky and on BBC and on Canal Plus. You don't have those same storytelling with the women's because we don't have a lot of those advanced models for the women. So we're missing out on that advanced storytelling. The broadcasters want this because not only do they want to differentiate in their storytelling, fans want this because women's sports fans are younger, they're more data-driven, they're more demanding of data, so having that data available to them is extremely important. And as you can see from the quote from Innie, it gives the broadcaster themselves more confidence because they're not only just prepping from their own experience, but they're using data to help inform and storytell. Innie, by the way, I gave her, with Martha's help, a bunch of data around the Euros, so she used Statsbomb data to call the Euros. So it helped her feel much more confident. When you think about the women's game, we're probably not seeing the same amount on the broadcaster side and certainly not on the fan side. Megan was showing this morning how in the US, there's a lot more data integrated into the fan viewing experience because that is what the fans are demanding. Again, we're challenged by this. Let's say we have all the resources or all the analytics and data we want, we still have some resource limitations as well. We are just starting to see some progress in the women's game, but we've come from a place where many sports teams, women's sports and women's football have been in survival mode. So we've had to prioritize facilities, we've had to prioritize staff, we've had to prioritize players. That's been really important. Also commercial, and I talked a little bit about this morning how important commercial is. So analytics has been a nice to have. In the last maybe year or two, we're starting to see a lot more embracing of it, but resources are still a big challenge. And a lot of women's football have coaches that are a little bit more traditional. And so for us, for example, in Lake Como, one of the challenges we had is we had a non-English speaking staff that wasn't going to just jump into a tool that wasn't in Italian. So our goal was to make it as simple as possible for them to embrace data. So what I have been doing there, you're using the tool now, but to ease them into it is I was actually extracting a bunch of the data, creating a report, translating it to Italian and sending it to them, just so they could start to use it and embrace it in a way that was very comfortable for them. Because it was their first time using it. They were using Y-Scout pretty broadly, but not as much on the metric side for recruiting and scouting, for match analysis and pre-match analysis. So this has been a way for us to just make it super simple for them to embrace it, despite the lack of resources. But now they're pretty excited about data, which is great. Lastly, I want to talk about the culture, which is not data, but it also plays into the growth. Women's football is different. Our fan engagement, the atmosphere is very, very different. The female athletes are very good at fan engagement. And the sponsors and partners actually have much stronger brand affinity with the fans, over like 50% more stronger affinity. And I actually was thinking about this myself because I was sitting at a baseball game and I realized I hadn't noticed any of the sponsors or partners, but when I go to a women's event, for some reason I do take a much more mental note of it. Maybe that's because of what I do, but there seems to be a much more strong affinity for sponsors, brand sponsors and fans in women's football and women's sports. Women's sports fans are also less tribal, so they follow their favorite athletes as opposed to their favorite teams, which makes it very different. But the culture is extremely different than men's football. If you've been to a women's football match, which I hope you have, you'll see that there's a lot more engagement, that it's more lively, there's a lot of families, just the atmosphere is extremely different. So a couple of key takeaways. We're still struggling with data collection coverage and advanced analytics that help us grow and do things like advanced storytelling, connect with fans, create more content that's data-driven, which is what fans, media, everybody wants. Those coverage issues include the talent, the basic coverage of event data, advanced models because we lack the depth of data itself, injuries, which has been a huge challenge in women's football in the last few years. And we just need more voices on this topic. So I hope that if I've done anything today in my 20 minutes of time, that I have reminded you to be a data champion for women's football and women's sports as well, because we are a growth stock. And we need that data because it's important to us as it is to the men's game, but we have a little bit of a deficit that we're running against that we need to make up. So thank you so much. Please watch women's football, and I appreciate your time.